Hello, I'm Gwen Eiffel. Welcome to the Washington Week Webcast Extra. I'm joined around the table by Molly Ball of The Atlantic, David Sanger of The New York Times, and Ed O'Keefe of The Washington Post. Only last week, we were devoting a large portion of the program to the disarray at the Veterans Administration that resulted in the resignation of Secretary Eric Shinseki. This week, key senators settled on an approach to reduce the waiting times. Ed, what would that approach be?
Well, it'd be a big one. Among other things, it would allow a VA secretary to more quickly fire or demote people who were found to be involved in these incidents all across the country. It would basically allow the department to use about $500 million they've got sitting there with nothing to do to hire new doctors and nurses across the country to help meet the growing demand from younger veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and aging veterans who are simply just getting old and turning to the VA for the first time. As part of that, they'd be allowed to lease 26 new hospitals across the country and parts of the country that have growing veterans populations. And it would address a host of other veterans issues that both the House and the Senate in different ways have been trying to get through Congress but haven't had the political will to do until this scandal spilled over and caused national outrage.
So, scandal spilled over, national outrage, big bipartisan agreement. Is it a big bipartisan agreement?
We'll see. Devil's in the details, and the bill isn't actually written yet. But the fact that it was written...
Wait, the bill's not written yet?
No, the agreement's there in principle, and the bill's being written this weekend. Somebody's weekend's been spoiled. But when you bring together the Brooklyn-born self-described socialist Bernie Sanders and John McCain, who, of course, has the gold-plated resume when it comes to Republican foreign affairs, military affairs.
I don't see any Democrats in that.
You don't, but they're all with Bernie Sanders, essentially,
okay.
Because he's been trying to do things that Democrats favored, expanding the department, making it easier for younger veterans especially to not only get VA benefits, but also some employment and education benefits. And they tried back in February to get a big, comprehensive, 140 different proposal kind of bill through the Senate, and Republicans blocked it by putting up an amendment that would have required sanctions against Iran. So they're now taking some of that, putting it into this new bill, and hoping that House Republicans next week or the week after will be willing to put this through.
Just add water. It was the big deal last week, and now doing something about it takes a little longer.
A lot longer.
David, we saw the president traveling to the G7 meeting this week, and everybody was waiting at the edge of their seats to see whether he would actually look Vladimir Putin in the eye and stare into his soul and actually exchange words after all of the disagreement there has been over Ukraine. Did any of that happen?
Well, he looked into his eye. Whether or not he saw his soul, we'll have to ask him when he gets back. And they talked for a few minutes. Now, coming out of that conversation, there were White House officials who said that Putin has now made some commitments and we'll just have to see whether they deliver on them. But they didn't say what the commitments were. We have seen Putin back away a little bit in the past few weeks. Quite strategically, the troops have come off of the Ukraine border. The election went ahead, and it was basically the pro-European candidate who won. I'm sure people fiddled with the election, but in the end, they didn't change the election. And so the question now is, do things go back to something akin to, if not normal, then at least an acceptance that Crimea is now part of Russia, something the U.S. has not acknowledged in any way, nor have the Europeans. And does this allow the Europeans then to turn around and say, you know, we're not doing more sanctions?
Well, a couple of things are happening. The Europeans have said they're not particularly that interested in sanctions, at least it's not as interested as we are. France is building a warship for Russia.
Two of them.
Two of them. But the other thing that's interesting to me is that we saw Putin meet with the new Ukrainian president-elect, Poroshenko, the chocolate king,
That's right.
And actually have a meeting together on the sidelines with Angela Merkel as interlocutor. So is that a sign that maybe there's something?
Well, Vladimir Putin's got to do one of two things with Mr. Poroshenko, other than eat chocolate. One of them is they got to be neighbors, which means they have to be able to begin to communicate. And the second is Putin has to decide, is he going to try to keep Ukraine under his thumb, keep them from getting closer to the Europeans, or is he going to say, okay, I've made my point, I've grabbed the most Russian-speaking parts of your country, either in toto, as in Crimea, or in part, as in the sections of eastern Ukraine. And so then the question is, how much is Putin satisfied with?
It'll be so interesting to watch that unfold. Molly, speaking of unfolding, I know you don't physically have it, but a lot of people do. This new Hillary Clinton biography, everybody's autobiography people have been waiting for, Hard Choices. Do we know whether she's revealing anything we didn't know?
It doesn't sound like there's a lot of real revelations in the book. But, you know, she's defending a lot of her decisions in the book. The book is about her term at the State Department. And despite the sort of first excerpt that was released, there was this sort of very soft piece about her mom and how much she loved her. It's not a memoir so much in, like, the personal sense, although there's also a little bit about planning her daughter's wedding. It's to me, a surprisingly defensive book. She seems to really be taking great pains to try to rebut all of her critics on all of the different controversial or contentious decisions that she made at the State Department. So there's this chapter about Benghazi where she attempts to put all the questions to rest. I'd be willing to bet that that doesn't actually put the questions to rest, but she's trying to put down a marker and say this is her argument, right? There's interestingly a lot about Bowe Bergdahl in there, and obviously this was being written before he was released, and she seems to be defending what critics might see as a failure to get him released. So she's talking about why under her watch they did fail to get him released. And interestingly, this week, as the administration's been defending its moves with Bergdahl, her advisors have sort of let word get around that she would not have taken this deal. She would have held out for a tougher deal.
It's so interesting.
So there's this dance, right, of the potential next nominee with the administration that she served in, where she's trying to create some distance. That's not really a surprise either. We've always known that she was a relatively hawkish voice within the administration on foreign policy. Always known that she was pushing harder on decisions like Syria than the president, further than the president wanted to go. So to have her come out now and say these things in her book, again, not altogether a surprise.
Can I ask you a question about something we didn't get to in the main broadcast, which was Joni Ernst, who's won the Senate nomination in Iowa? Not just by a little bit. The discussion at the beginning of the week is whether she would make it past the 35% cutoff to avoid a state convention to nominate. But instead, she won going away.
More than 50% in a very crowded field of candidates. Iowa has been a really pleasant surprise for national Republicans. This was not a race that they thought they had a chance in. Democrats have a pretty well-liked nominee, a congressman from eastern Iowa, Bruce Braley, who did not have a primary. Republicans is sort of this.
And this is Tom Harkin's seat, it should be said, so right. A staunch Democrat.
Right. And then Republicans had this sort of melee of nobodies. There were a lot of better qualified Republicans who declined to get into the race, and then a bunch of sort of people nobody had heard of vying for the Republican nomination, having to appeal to the very staunch right wing that's very active in Iowa, which was pulling everybody to the right, and there's worries that they might nominate someone who was unacceptable to the mainstream of the electorate. Joni Ernst emerged and sort of surprised everybody. She's a very articulate candidate. She's a state senator. She's served in the military. She had this ad that everyone was talking about where she talked about castrating pigs and making them squeal in Washington. But she also is the model of this new kind of Republican candidate who unites the Tea Party and the Republican establishment. This is someone who managed to be endorsed by Mitt Romney and Sarah Palin. The Senate Conservatives Fund and the Chamber of Commerce. That's a really remarkable fusion to pull off, and that shows that she will have Republicans united. The question is whether she can appeal now to the rest of the electorate.
Midterm elections get interestinger and interestinger every single week. Thank you, Molly, and thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody. Stay online and see what else our panelists are writing and reporting about, including my take this week on how politics just gets in the way. That's at pbs.org/Washington Week, and we'll see you on the next Washington Week Webcast Extra.